A cold voice echoed through the boarding gate. "I'm sorry, first class is full. Please move to economy." With that single sentence, Helena Cross's world was suddenly swallowed by a suffocating silence. A black woman, 45 years old, wearing a simple black cashmere sweater, neat gray slacks, and soft leather shoes with no shine. She looked to others like nothing more than a weary traveler, perhaps an ordinary professor, someone who did not seem worthy of sitting in the best seat on the plane. But behind that appearance, Helena was the new owner of the entire Skyjet airline. The acquisition finalized quietly just 3 days earlier. She gave a faint smile, not from surprise, but from familiarity. How many times in her life, from Ivy League lecture halls to corporate boardrooms filled with white collars, had she seen that look repeated again and again, the look that said she did not belong? Helena drew a deep breath and kept her voice calm. "My ticket clearly says seat 1A. In front of her stood Sandra, the chief flight attendant with a stiff blonde bob and icy blue eyes, arms crossed, blocking her path. Her voice dripped with false authority. "Perhaps the system made a mistake. I suggest you don't cause trouble." From the corner, Emily, a young attendant, watched with uneasy eyes. Her heart pounded, but fear held her lips shut. Helena handed over her boarding pass. The scanner beeped. The green light flashed, undeniable proof. Sandra hesitated for half a second, then quickly fabricated another lie. "That seat is already taken by a platinum member. You'll have to move." Her words were sharp as blades, casting Helena as the intruder. A swell of indignation rose inside Helena. Her chest tightened, but her face remained composed, as if she were a scientist calmly observing an experiment. To her, this was more than a personal insult. It was live data, clear evidence of a cultural disease within the very company she had just purchased. Passengers began murmuring. A man frowned, annoyed by the delay. A woman in sunglasses smirked with impatience. The crowd, unwittingly, became accomplices to a public humiliation. Sandra knew it, and she used it. Shame in front of others was the quickest way to force someone to back down. But Helena did not retreat. Her voice dropped low, cold, and sharp as steel. "My seat is 1A. If you need confirmation, call the head attendant." At that moment, Martin, the 50-year-old supervisor, arrived. He did not glance at her ticket, did not ask a single question. He listened to Sandra, then turned to Helena, his voice laced with false sweetness. "Ma'am, we don't want any trouble. Please return to the counter to resolve this. In other words, leave." Emily lowered her head, her chest tightening. She knew this was wrong, but fear sealed her silence. That silence, Helena realized, was more cruel than the blatant lies. In that moment, time seemed to slow. Helena looked into Martin's eyes, then Sandra's, and saw the entire system. The liar, the accomplice, the silent witness. Every link in the chain was broken. Then, suddenly, the pace quickened. The tension pressed down. Martin pressed the call button for the captain. Captain Harris, 57, stepped out of the cockpit. He carried the air of authority of a man responsible for hundreds of lives. But after hearing only a few words from Sandra, he did not verify, did not ask Helena a single question. His verdict was cold. 2 options: move to economy or leave the aircraft. In that instant, Helena's blood boiled. Her entire body tensed, but her face grew calm, unnervingly cold. It was the silence of a storm just before it tore everything apart. Sandra smiled in triumph. Martin sighed in relief. Captain Harris believed the matter was over. Only Emily saw something different in Helena's eyes, something they had not yet recognized. Helena gave the slightest nod, then turned. No resistance, no protest. But as she neared the aircraft door, her hand slipped quietly into her pocket. A heavy satellite phone glimmered with a cold green light. One press, one call, one order that took only seconds to give. And in that moment, the fate of the entire crew was irreversibly changed. "Daniel," Helena whispered, her voice low and cold as steel. Just 2 syllables left her lips, yet thousands of miles away, they struck like a siren. Inside the operations center of Cross Aeronautics in New York, Daniel Ortiz, 38, Helena's most trusted aide, shot upright in his chair. He had heard that voice only twice in his career. Once when their satellite network was under attack, and once when a defense contract nearly collapsed. That voice never appeared unless the world itself was on the brink. "Code Indigo," Helena continued. Daniel swallowed hard. The screens before him lit up with flashing red alerts. Code Indigo meant one thing: a total lockdown of operations and an immediate transfer of authority to the CEO. No debate, no delay. "Understood, ma'am," he replied, his fingers racing over the keyboard, transmitting orders straight to the Chicago control tower. Just minutes later, inside the cockpit of Skyjet 808, a flat voice from air traffic control came through. "Flight 808, stop immediately. Emergency order from headquarters, Alpha priority. Hold position. Do not depart the gate." The cockpit grew heavy with silence. Captain Harris frowned, his voice sharp over the intercom. "What? Who has the authority to issue this order?" The signature reads, Cross, Helena Cross. That name detonated like a bomb inside the cabin. Sandra froze, her lips trembling. Martin stared blankly, the color drained from his face. Emily let out a small gasp, clutching her clipboard as her heart pounded. They could hardly believe it. The woman they had just belittled at the boarding door was, in fact, the new owner of the airline. The boarding door swung open. The sharp rhythm of hurried footsteps echoed across the jet bridge. COO Victor Lin, 52, drenched in sweat, rushed in as if racing against fate itself. His eyes locked on Helena, and then he nearly bowed under the weight of the moment, as though standing before the highest judge. "Dr. Cross, I beg your pardon. This was a terrible misunderstanding." Sandra's throat tightened, her eyes wide with shock. That name hammered inside her skull. Helena Cross, founder of a space technology empire. The press had crowned her the Queen of Strategy, and now she was the very humiliated passenger they had just tried to cast aside. In the first-class cabin, whispers spread like wildfire. A few phones were discreetly raised to record. The air thickened with chaos and fear. Helena said nothing. She simply stood there, tall and unshaken, her gaze calm yet sharp as a blade. The entire cabin fell silent. In that silence, those who had postured and sneered now faced one undeniable truth. They had mistaken a mountain for a pebble. Then she began to walk, slow and deliberate, each step like the beat of a war drum. Sandra, Martin, and Harris instinctively recoiled. Emily lowered her head, tears spilling onto her worn black shoes. Helena's voice finally broke the air, deep and resonant. "Consider this your first lesson. What you did today was not a mistake. It was a disease." No one dared to breathe too loudly, because all of them knew. The trial had begun, and the judge standing before them was also their absolute master, ready to deliver her verdict. The first-class cabin was silent, the steady hum of the engines beating like the drums of a strange tribunal, where judge, victim, and owner were all embodied in a single figure. Helena Cross. She stood in the aisle, graceful yet terrifying, her gaze cold enough to send shivers through the cabin. She did not need to raise her voice. Every word she spoke cut sharp as a scalpel. "We begin with you," Helena said, eyes locked on Sandra. The chief flight attendant, once so haughty, was frozen stiff. "You gave yourself the right to judge passengers with your eyes. You ignored the clear electronic evidence and fabricated a lie. You did not only humiliate me, you turned the Skyjet brand into a public joke. You are not an employee, Sandra. You are a liability, a lawsuit waiting to happen." Sandra trembled, lips moving as if to offer excuses, but the dozens of phones recording her left every defense stuck in her throat. Helena turned to Martin. The man who always chose the easy path was pale as chalk. "You are a shift supervisor. Your duty is to verify, to resolve, to safeguard the airline's reputation. But you did not ask. You did not check. You refused to confront the truth. You chose instead the laziness and prejudice of your subordinate because it was easier. You are not a leader, Martin. You are a follower." Martin lowered his head, shoulders heavy, fists clenched but powerless to answer. Next, Helena faced Captain Harris. He stood tall, trying to preserve his authority, but his eyes betrayed his unease. "Captain, the man entrusted with hundreds of lives. Your authority is not a privilege. It is a responsibility. Yet you judge me based on one-sided claims, without investigation, without evidence. You were ready to expel a paying passenger with a valid ticket. Safety is not only a matter of mechanics, it begins with fairness. And you failed before we even left the ground." Harris clenched his jaw, his hand trembling at the cockpit door. The authority he believed untouchable crumbled under the gaze of the woman he had dismissed. Finally, Helena's eyes softened when they fell on Emily. The young attendant's tears brimmed, her hands clutching the fabric of her uniform. "And you, Emily?" Helena said, her voice less cold, almost a reminder. "You knew what was happening was wrong. I saw the fear in your eyes, but you chose silence. Remember this. Silence in the face of injustice is complicity. This lesson will stay with you if you are brave enough to change." Emily broke into sobs, nodding desperately, tears soaking the small name badge pinned to her chest. Helena drew a deep breath, lifting her chin. Her voice rang clear and sharp as steel. 4 people, 4 different kinds of failure, but the common thread. You have just turned this first-class cabin into living proof of a rotten culture. And as CEO, I carry the duty to eradicate this disease at its root. The air thickened. Passengers held their breath. Sandra collapsed into a seat. Martin slumped. Harris stared down at the floor, and Emily wept openly. Helena tightened her grip on the phone in her hand. This tribunal was not yet over. The verdict would be delivered here and now, under the eyes of everyone on board. The air in the first-class cabin was thick, compressed as though every breath was being held back, every eye fixed on Helena. She took one more step forward, her voice dropping lower. Each word precise, no need for shouting, yet it landed like a gavel on the table of a courtroom. "From this moment," Helena said, her gaze piercing Sandra, "you are terminated. No more uniform, no more false authority. You sold out the trust of passengers to feed your own prejudice. Leave this aircraft." Sandra collapsed into herself, trembling hands gripping the leather seat, her mouth releasing weak, desperate pleas. But Helena did not turn back. 2 security officers entered, their faces expressionless, bowed respectfully to their CEO, and gestured. Sandra was almost dragged down the aisle, her sobs dissolving into the hushed whispers of passengers. Helena turned to Martin, the supervisor who only minutes ago had tried to wield authority. "Mr. Martin," she said, her voice dry and unyielding, "I hired you to lead, not to follow. You chose convenience over truth. A leader like you is nothing more than grass bending with the wind. You are also dismissed, effective immediately." Martin's jaw dropped, his body swaying as if his support had been pulled away. He started to protest, but Helena's icy stare froze the words in his throat. He lowered his head, shuffling behind Sandra, his back bent as though carrying a lifetime of shame. Every eye shifted toward Captain Harris. The seasoned pilot with salt and pepper hair stood tall, still trying to preserve his dignity, but the twitching of his hands betrayed the panic inside. "Captain Harris," Helena said, her tone cold enough to chill bone, "you hold supreme authority in the sky, but you twisted that authority into convenience. You did not investigate, you did not ask, you did not seek evidence. You simply wanted to discard what troubled you. To me, you are no longer a captain. You are a safety hazard. You are relieved of command. Right now." A gasp swept through the cabin. A captain dismissed before takeoff. Harris's face flushed red, his fists clenched, but the sound of boots behind him sealed his fate. His eyes flashed with one last ember of fury, like a dethroned king, before he too turned and walked away in utter disgrace. Helena's eyes shifted to Emily. The young woman trembled, tears streaming down her cheeks, her hand clasped tightly together. "Emily," Helena said, her voice softening, no longer a sentence but a lesson. "You could have saved this, but today you let fear triumph over conscience. You will leave Skyjet, not because I wish to destroy you, but because you must start over. Silence in the face of injustice is complicity with injustice." Emily broke down, sobbing as she nodded again and again, then was gently escorted out of the cabin. The entire crew was removed in dead silence. The passengers remained frozen, wide-eyed, unable to believe they had just witnessed something unprecedented in the history of aviation. A CEO, on board her own aircraft, stripping an entire flight crew of their roles in a single moment. Helena stood tall, drawing a deep breath, her gaze sweeping over every passenger. In their shock, she saw no victory, only the weight of a vow, to rebuild from the ruins of what had just collapsed. Before turning away, her voice rang low, steady, and resolute. "This is not revenge. This is purification. Skyjet will no longer have room for prejudice and cowardice." And in that moment, everyone understood. The verdict was not only for the 4 who had been dismissed, but a warning bell for the entire system. The first-class cabin remained wrapped in heavy silence after the entire crew had been escorted out. A few passengers still had not closed their mouths from what they had just witnessed. Phones that had been recording trembled in hands, because everyone knew they had just become witnesses to a moment that could go down in aviation history. Helena sat down in seat 1A, placed her leather bag on her lap, then lifted her head and looked straight ahead. She did not feel triumph, only a crushing weight. If these 4 people had dared to display such open prejudice and injustice, how many others across the system were quietly doing the same? The sound of hurried footsteps echoed. Victor Lin, the 52-year-old COO, still sweating, approached Helena's seat. His voice cracked with tension. "Dr. Cross, what do you want me to do?" Helena turned, her eyes glinting like cold steel. Her voice was low, firm, with not a hint of hesitation. "Victor, from this moment, Skyjet must be reborn. I want a full audit within 72 hours. Every recruitment process, every training program, every customer complaint, dig into every number, every report. The entire cabin held its breath. Her words were not just an order. They were the opening drumbeat of a new war. You want us to review the entire 2-year history? Victor asked, his voice unsteady. Helena nodded. Yes, I want to know how many complaints were buried, who ignored them. I want the system to tell the truth instead of the polished reports you have handed to shareholders. And one more thing. She leaned forward, her voice dropping lower but carrying the weight of a hammer. I want an anonymous reporting channel for frontline staff. I will not accept that a young woman like Emily has to stay silent out of fear. Anyone who witnesses injustice and keeps their mouth shut betrays Skyjet. I want that to end. Victor nodded repeatedly, typing frantic notes into his tablet while breathing heavily like a man running a marathon. Passengers nearby looked at Helena with a completely different expression. No longer a humiliated woman, but the image of a commander restoring discipline to her army. Helena straightened her back, her voice ringing clear this time for every passenger to hear. Ladies and gentlemen, today you have witnessed a failure that cannot be forgiven. But I promise you that will never again be the true face of Skyjet under my leadership. A ripple of murmurs spread through the cabin. The middle-aged man in seat 2B nodded firmly. A young woman in row 3 allowed herself a relieved smile. To make amends for what you have endured, Helena continued, all tickets for this flight will be fully refunded. In addition, each of you will receive a complimentary round-trip ticket for the class you purchased. This is not a gift. This is an apology. The words were decisive, without a trace of pretense. Applause erupted. Some passengers even stood. The doubtful eyes from earlier now turned into admiration. Helena drew a long breath, then leaned back into seat 1A. The applause still echoed. But in her mind, a question thundered. How many more diseases were hidden inside the giant body of Skyjet? And did she have the strength to cut them out at the root? In Helena's eyes, her resolve was clear. The real battle had only just begun. A sharp, metallic sound rang out as the cabin door opened once more. Passengers held their breath, thinking the storm had not yet passed, and another was about to arrive. But instead of tension, a new crew stepped in, uniforms crisp, eyes focused, their presence radiating professionalism. Leading them was Maria Lopez, 42, a veteran chief flight attendant with more than 20 years of experience. Her voice was deep and steady, carrying authority but softened with warmth. Ladies and gentlemen, I am the lead flight attendant in charge of today's flight. We sincerely apologize for what you have just endured. From this moment forward, we are here to ensure your journey is safe, comfortable, and worthy. The tone in her words was different, no arrogance, only commitment. Passengers nodded in unison, a few exhaling with relief as though waking from a nightmare. Helena sat still in seat 1A. Her sharp gaze studying every gesture. She did not need to give orders. Her very presence was an unspoken command. Maria stepped closer, bowed her head slightly, and spoke with reverence. Dr. Cross, it is an honor to serve you. Please rest assured, nothing is more important than restoring trust in Skyjet. Helena gave a faint nod, replying only, a bottle of water and a safe, on-time flight. That is all. Maria smiled gently and walked away, moving with the poise of a commander leading her troops into battle. Meanwhile, COO Victor Lin stood outside, fingers flying across his tablet as he made rapid calls to operations. He was spinning like a top, executing each of Helena's directives. Sweat still clung to his forehead. But in his eyes, a new spark of resolve had ignited. This time, he could not afford to fail. Moments later, the cabin speakers came alive. The voice of the new captain, Elaine Carter, 39, rang out steady and calm. "Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. This is your captain for Skyjet Flight 808. We have completed the crew change. The aircraft will depart in just a few minutes. Thank you for your patience. We promise this journey will be safe and smooth." The engines rumbled gently. The fuselage quivered. Passengers exchanged glances, then broke into smiles. They had not only heard an apology, they had seen change with their own eyes. Helena leaned back, her gaze drifting to the window. The runway lights streaked past like shooting stars. The massive Boeing rolled forward, accelerating, shaking, pressing bodies into seats. In the moment the aircraft lifted off the ground, Helena's heart pounded. She felt no triumph, no vengeance, only one overwhelming sensation: rebirth. Skyjet was not just lifting off the runway. It was rising from its own shadows. The massive Boeing trembled softly before surging upward, piercing through dense gray clouds and leaving behind streaks of fractured silver light. Inside the first-class cabin, the steady hum of the engines echoed like the heartbeat of a giant, reassuring passengers that the journey was once again on course. Helena sat still, her gaze fixed on the window. Afternoon sunlight spilled through the layers of clouds, a warm golden glow washing across her face. Yet within her, another storm had not subsided. Silence. That word echoed in her mind again and again. Sandra had lied. Martin had been cowardly. Harris had been authoritarian. But Emily, the young woman with trembling eyes, was the clearest reflection of the sickness embedded within the system, the fear that breeds silence. Helena remembered those eyes vividly, eyes that wanted to speak but locked themselves in chains no one else could see. She closed her eyes, and memories surged back. 20 years earlier, in the lecture hall of a prestigious university, she, the only black student in the room, heard a professor say bluntly, "Some people are only here because of diversity policies, not merit." That day, the hall fell silent. No one stood up, no one objected. Eyes dropped to desks, and in that silence, she felt herself disappear. Today, in first class, the scene replayed. Emily knew the truth, but she lowered her head. The silence of one person was enough to turn injustice into an unwritten law. Helena shivered, wondering how many other Emilys were scattered across Skyjet. How many times had silence killed justice before it could find a voice? A new flight attendant approached quietly, placing a glass of water on her table. Helena smiled in thanks, giving a slight nod as if to say, "I see the care in your eyes." That small gesture only deepened her realization. Culture is not written on corporate walls. It is carved in the choices people make in their smallest moments. Passengers began to relax, some whispering softly. Never seen a CEO handle something on the spot like that. A woman in seat 3C leaned toward her companion. "I think Skyjet will truly change. She isn't like those who only offer shallow apologies." Helena heard their words, and her heart grew heavier. This was not the joy of victory. It was a reminder of the immense weight now on her shoulders. She was not simply correcting one mistake. She had to transform an entire system, from silence to courage, from fear to voice. Her eyes shifted from the glowing sky outside back to the screen of her tablet. Lines of text appeared. "Full audit report due Monday." She drew a deep breath, pressing her hand against her chest as if to remind herself. This flight was a test. But the real battle had only just begun. The plane had leveled off at cruising altitude. Golden light poured into the cabin, casting a warm glow over the deep brown leather seats in first class. The tension in the air had eased, but inside Helena, another rhythm pulsed relentlessly. The rhythm of plans just beginning to take shape. She opened her tablet and scrolled through Skyjet's old reports. Complaint statistics appeared on the screen, cold and clinical. Resolved. Case closed. No evidence found. Too neat, too clean, almost fabricated. Helena smirked. Behind these silent statistics, there had to be voices that had been smothered. Victor Lin, the COO, approached, trying to regain his professional composure. He leaned closer and whispered, "Dr. Cross, I've assembled an emergency team to begin the audit, but I need a clear direction. What do you want us to prioritize first?" Helena lifted her gaze, eyes sharp enough to pierce through him. "We must break the wall of silence." Victor hesitated, uncertain. Helena set the tablet down, her voice steady yet resonant, like a bell. "We will establish an anonymous reporting channel. Frontline employees must have the right to speak up without fear of retaliation. Every report will go directly to the CEO's office. No more layers blocking the truth. No more silencing." Victor nodded vigorously, scribbling notes. But Helena wasn't finished. "Second," she continued, "we restructure the training program, not just teaching service skills, but instilling fairness and courage. Employees must understand. Silence in the face of injustice is betrayal of the brand." Nearby passengers overheard fragments of her words, their expressions shifting from surprise to admiration. One man whispered, "She's rewriting the entire company culture mid-flight." Helena tilted her head, eyes drifting toward the vast horizon outside the window. The endless sky stretched before her, a metaphor for the future she intended to build. In her mind, Emily's image surfaced vividly. The tear-filled eyes, the trembling lips, the voice that never found the courage to speak. "We must create a Skyjet where Emily's will no longer bow their heads," Helena thought. "A Skyjet where truth is spoken immediately, instead of being buried in fabricated reports." Victor waited for the final order, and Helena gave a slight nod. Third, every report of passenger discrimination in the last 24 months must be unearthed. I want every name, every incident, and I want to look directly into the eyes of those who buried them. Victor nodded again, sweat forming on his forehead, as though he had just received a verdict against the entire system. The aircraft continued to slice through the quiet sky, but within Helena, the plan had already roared to life like a massive machine. Gears beginning to turn, grinding down the old fragments to clear the way for a new culture to rise. A chime rang out. Every passenger turned their eyes forward as Helena slowly rose to her feet. She did not need a microphone, yet she moved to the front of the cabin where every gaze could see her face clearly. Light from the window streamed in, igniting her eyes as if they held the entire sky outside. "Ladies and gentlemen," Helena began, her voice low but carrying effortlessly, "I know you have endured a humiliation you did not deserve. You came here to fly, to be served, not to witness a performance built on falsehood, and you deserve far more than a simple apology." A ripple of whispers spread. Phones were still recording, but now not out of curiosity, rather out of respect. Helena took another step forward, her eyes sweeping across every face. A middle-aged man clutching his briefcase, a young woman still trembling from the shock, a little boy hugging his stuffed bear, staring at her without blinking. "You have just witnessed 4 Skyjet employees being dismissed," Helena continued. "But that is not the end of this matter. It is only the beginning. Because I believe a company cannot survive if in first class there is contempt, and in economy there is silence. The words shot through the cabin like a current. A woman broke into quiet sobs. A man nodded vigorously. "Remember this," Helena pressed, her voice striking like a gavel. "Skyjet does not belong to Sandra, nor to Harris, nor to those who chose silence. Skyjet belongs to you, the ones who entrust your lives and your faith to these wings. And it belongs to me, the one who now bears ultimate responsibility from this day forward." The cabin erupted in applause. At first scattered, then swelling, then thunderous. Helena bowed her head slightly, letting the wave of acclaim wash over, yet her eyes shone not with pride, but with resolve. She gestured to Victor Lin. He stepped forward immediately, his voice trembling but firm with conviction. "On behalf of the executive board, I promise that every passenger on this flight will be fully refunded and will also receive an additional round-trip ticket in the class you purchased. This is not only an apology. This is a pledge that under Dr. Cross's leadership, Skyjet will change at its core." Applause roared again. A passenger stood, raising his phone high. "This is what a real CEO looks like." Helena's gaze swept across the cabin. The anger that had once burned had now transformed into a deeper determination. In her eyes, these were no longer strangers, but witnesses to a new beginning. She understood. From this day on, every step she took would be watched, every word she spoke recorded. And that was the greatest motivation to never turn back. This flight was not only carrying them to New York, it was carrying Skyjet out of its own shadows. The engines rumbled low, then eased back as the Boeing tilted its wings and began its descent. Through the window, the lights of New York flickered like a trail of stars falling to earth. Passengers stirred softly, preparing for the moment of touchdown. Helena leaned back, her eyes half closed. In the vibration of the fuselage, she listened to the sound within herself. No longer anger, no longer humiliation. Only a single question echoed. Was she strong enough to cleanse a system corroded by silence and prejudice? She remembered Emily's downcast eyes, the fear that forced the young woman into silence. And Helena understood. The real task was not in firing a few names. The real task was to build an environment where people like Emily could lift their heads and speak the truth. The plane touched down. The body shuddered hard. Tires screeched against the runway. Yet instead of tension, the cabin erupted in applause. That applause was not only for a safe landing, but also for the landing of a rotten culture that had just been exposed. Helena opened her eyes and looked around the cabin. Relieved smiles, admiring glances, phones still recording every moment. She saw herself not only as passenger 1A, not only as a CEO. She was the living promise that fairness still had a place, even in a world that so often bowed to prejudice. She drew a long breath and placed her hand on the leather bag beside her. Inside were thick documents of a new aerospace project. But Helena knew her true challenge was not in technology. It was in people, in how they treated one another. The cabin door opened. The cool night air rushed in. Helena rose, her figure straight and unwavering, her first step onto the runway resonating like the beginning of a new era. In her mind, she whispered, "Power does not lie in giving orders. Power lies in the courage to change." And from today, Skyjet would take flight once more, in the sky of fairness. In the world of business, many companies collapse not because of outdated technology or flawed strategies, but because their culture has been poisoned from within. The story of Helena Cross gives us a clear lesson. True power does not lie in the seat of authority or the numbers in a report. but in the ability to confront injustice and to make corrections even when the truth is uncomfortable to face. An airline can replace aircraft and upgrade services, but if it does not change the way people treat one another, then everything else is only an empty shell. Helena has shown that sometimes one decisive action can not only salvage a single flight, but also reshape an entire future. If you believe that fairness is the sail that allows any organization to go far, hit a to help this story spread even further. Do not forget to subscribe to join us on the journeys ahead, where the truth will always be revealed and trust will be rebuilt from the smallest of actions. And I want to hear your voice. Leave a comment with the words fairness, so we can affirm together that only when fairness is present does the sky truly open wide.